Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about what I think is one of the most interesting films of the year, and that is Here by director Robert Zemeckis. It just hit theaters. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So a lot has been said about Hollywood's kind of current creative rut, how it's seemingly just sort of slaps different coats of paint on the same stale stories and then churns them out. I think to an increasingly unsatisfied audience. But every now and then, a film does arrive as a very genuine breath of just fresh air and originality. And here, I think, is one such movie. It's a boundary-pushing film that is really, I think, like unlike anything I have ever seen before. Although, like most sort of experimental creations, I think this is a movie that is very likely to spark very polarized responses. Some people are really going to dig this film, other people are just not going to connect with it at all. But you can count me among those who just really like this movie. I think its very unique storytelling approach will require some patience from audiences, and it can feel at least a little bit gimmicky at times. But to me, here is a very wildly inventive and I think profound meditation on the moments and the memories that can make our very brief lives meaningful. And this is a movie that I have been looking forward to really since the moment I saw its first very intriguing trailer. I think kind of the primary intrigue of this film is that its entire runtime is shot in a fixed, almost dioramic perspective without any movement, kind of camera movements throughout. The story kind of unfolds as a very sweeping historical journey that is focused on a singular plot of land. I think more importantly, the people that populated it, going all the way back to the extinction of the dinosaurs, all the way up until present day. And most of the story takes place within a single living room of a house that was built upon that plot of land, as and the various families who ultimately occupied that house, also using de-aging technology to showcase those characters at different stages of their life. And kind of as a result, this is a movie that is almost paradoxically both staggeringly vast and also is exceedingly narrow in its scope. And I think whether this movie resonates with viewers will largely depend on whether they find its very unique storytelling approach to be provocative or merely frustrating. I think here is not a movie that you necessarily watch for the plot, at least not in a traditional sense of a familiar three-act story arc. Instead, this is a movie that attempts to weave together I think a very ambitious tapestry that presents a more philosophical and emotional picture of life. And kind of in that way, it's more a collection of moments and memories that contribute to the big picture more than they always do to the scenes that come either directly before or afterwards. I think this is a film that is best experienced kind of by taking it in holistically as a whole, rather than trying to make it fit into any kind of established box of, a very normal cinematic story. And to that end, I think audiences looking for a more traditional story may grow impatient with its seemingly meandering story, and or even frustrated, I think, by the many narrative detours that don't always seem to impact the main characters in any sort of immediate way. But I think for audiences that do sort of buy into the film's central premise as a more thematic exploration rather than a narrative one, I think this film does offer a very compelling look at life and just what it means to be human. Because watching this movie, I think, captures sort of the nostalgic, the kind of sentimental feeling of looking back through an old photo album. And I think the film even intentionally evokes sort of that photo album motif in some very interesting ways of using a visual cue of almost picture in picture boxes, the frames of a Polaroid picture, to transition between scenes or even to juxtapose different moments simultaneously. And the various narrative threads may be only loosely connected, but I do think they in effective ways echo each other on a more thematic level. Kind of this idea that times may change, but I think the way that this movie is constructed just reminds us that, hey, people have always been experiencing sort of those same, peaks and valleys, of life since the beginning of time, whether that's, the joy of a newborn baby or, the lament over an unrealized dream or the fire of new love or just the sorrow of mortality or painful goodbyes. And the vast narrative gaps in the story can make it hard at times to connect to the characters with a whole lot of intimacy. Though the super human likability of actor Tom Hanks obviously goes a very long way. But the characters that populate this story are not always the very easy to root for Hollywood heroes. But I think that fact also makes them very compelling, because really all the characters in this movie are just strikingly ordinary people, very deeply flawed and human. I think kind of more the type of people that you're likely to encounter in the house next door to you, rather than up on the silver screen. But for all of its very intriguing elements, the film doesn't always sort of pull its threads together seamlessly. I think kind of the lack of any camera movement sometimes gives the the film almost the feeling of a live theatrical play, and it may take audiences. I know it did for me, like time just to adjust to like the rhythm of that. And I think the same is probably true just for the de-aging of the actors. I think the technology has obviously come a very long way from sort of the early days, but the sight of like a digitally de-aged character still unfortunately resides somewhere within sort of that uncanny valley. Although I think perhaps most of that is due just to the knowledge that, actors like Tom Hanks or Robin Wright are obviously not teenagers anymore, rather than there being anything like particularly jarring or off-putting about the visuals themselves. And like the use of such technology, I think remains very highly controversial and even like morally debatable. But I think here may represent like the best, I think most justified use of it. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, there is some stuff to be aware of. For language, there's one very clearly articulated F-bomb, and I didn't get like, an exact count, but there is frequent profanities really all throughout this movie, which does include almost an unusually high volume of characters that do use like the names of God and Jesus in vain. For violence, no real violence in this movie other than some characters die, from health-related issues. For sexuality, there is some stuff here. There's one scene where a woman like poses for photographs topless, although like no nudity itself is depicted. She's always sort of covered up either with her arms or she's like the picture's taken from behind, so you see her bare back, but you don't see her from the front. There's also a painting in which there's a nude woman depicted that is visible in at least one scene. There's another scene that's played more like humorously, where a woman indicates her desire to have sex with her husband, leading him to sort of like undo and drop his pants and kind of stagger upstairs wearing his underwear. Kind of that same couple is shown in another scene, at least beginning to make love on a sofa, and later they do almost like playfully recall that moment with a character saying, to someone else, that they were going hot and heavy. And there's also this sort of more implied sexuality, such as like a teenage girl becomes pregnant by her teenage boyfriend, and another, like an older man, a husband, admits to his son for having committed infidelity. As far as themes, worldview, kind of things going on beneath the surface, kind of the main theme for me is just mortality and kind of like memories. The biblical author of Ecclesiastes, I think famously wrote, there is a time for everything, a season for every activity under the sun. I think here as a movie is about sort of that natural kind of God-ordained rhythm of life. It's an almost like visceral reminder that, although like our own life story may feel very immediate and all-consuming, it is merely sort of one small blip in like the vastness of history. I think it also demonstrates that like, despite our very unique lives, there is a shared like humanity that does connect us with our neighbor. And in the final moments, I think one of my favorite parts of this entire film is where the movie finally does break its like stationary perspective, and the camera does begin to move and kind of zoom out from the house, giving a visual to just sort of a bunch of other, rooftops in the neighborhood. And I think it does sort of challenge viewers that kind of every day, all around us, people and families are sort of these fellow pilgrims on this very like universal journey of life. And just the theme of like mortality is sort of ever present in this film. At one point, a character declares something like, the future is the only direction that we can go. And in one sense, it has almost a very like melancholic, almost nihilistic perspective on life. I think particularly because in the film, there's only sort of like a cursory presence of faith or religion. But this sense that like our lives are brief and like the homes that we make, our memories in today will ultimately be occupied by others. And, one day we'll all be forgotten to history. And kind of the idea that like, if that is true, then like, is there any real purpose to life? But at the same time, I also think there's a very hopeful and almost inspiring sense in the way that this movie explores mortality. Yes, life is brief, but God has given us a very like beautiful gift to fill that life with, poignant memories. And, we only get one life, and so we must strive to live it well. And at the very end of this film, Tom Hanks' character, we're kind of looking back on his life, remarks, I have no regrets. And it's like a sentimental notion, but I think also perhaps a questionable one. I think in one sense, it is like a healthy acceptance that, the story of our life, both the good and the bad, ultimately is like what makes us who we are. But I think even so, like Tom Hanks's character is also characterized by just sort of like the constant worry, kind of looking to the future, hoping for career breakthroughs that never seem to come, or just dreams that are ultimately left unfulfilled. And the scripture that came to mind is this Matthew 6:34, where Jesus, said, "Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." And kind of to that end, I think what makes life meaningful, at least from like an earthly perspective, is the journey, not just the destination. I think the future may indeed be like the only direction that we're able to head, but I think here as a movie just reminds us to like live life in the present and just seize the most kind of every moment to its fullest. So in the end, I think here is a film that won't resonate with all viewers. I think kind of the same unconventional and like, inventive elements that do make it very fresh and provocative can also make it somewhat frustrating and challenging. I think even so, like in a current Hollywood landscape that I think too often just elects to play it safe, I think it is commendable for a filmmaker to take such a bold, creative swing. I think here is a complicated, sometimes like messy viewing experience, but then again, so is life. I think this is a movie that just reminds viewers that our years on Earth are fleeting and almost like soberingly small, like the vast scheme of history, and yet the memories, the moments that we experience along the way, can make it a very beautiful and meaningful life. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you go check out this movie, if you're connected with it as much as I did, or hey, if you just sort of found it a slog, you didn't resonate with it, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about that. If you haven't done so, to encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Lots of other movie reviews. Got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast. Got some interviews. Just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. Most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through a world for Christ.